Hello, friends, and welcome back to Stories About Entitled People. In our first story, we're going to tell you about an altercation between neighbors that turned into a lawsuit. But before we begin, don't forget to subscribe to our channel if you're new here and turn on notifications so you don't miss a new video every single day. Here we go. Don't mess with our private territory. We've been living in a mid-upper class street of my town for about 10 years now. Due to regulations that our real estate agent didn't mention when selling it to my mom and dad, our foundations were set lower than one of our neighbors, which was not much of a problem until the neighbor right in front of us — we have a small sideway in the street where our other houses are located, so our houses are just 4 meters apart from each other — started to grow bushes to seal off his garden from the outside world. When we noticed them getting bigger, we did what every person would do and jokingly reminded him to please keep the bushes in check so they don't grow too big. They ignored it for as long as they lived there, which freaked my mother out. She's mentally ill, which ultimately led to her not being able to really work anything but a €450 job anymore, despite her only being in her late 40s. Me and my brother weren't able to clean our front yard as often as it needs to be cleaned due to school and university being very stressful. We would have it cleaned on a daily basis, even in the summer, because the bushes were shedding leaves left and right. Another thing that was annoying was that our rain drains for our front porch and garage were stuffed up with leaves that would regularly overflow. My neighbors then moved out about 1 year ago, and a new couple moved in, who we first thought were nice. Turns out they were even worse than the other neighbors and even mouthier. They made it very clear that the sealed-off garden and their house having a higher foundation than ours and the rest of our neighbors' properties were the main reasons they bought it, and they won't change anything about it. My mom was getting so freaked out about all of that, keep in mind that she's ill, that she was close to selling the house. The neighbor kept being annoying as hell and even threw parties in his garden, which oftentimes were loud and kept all neighbors awake, resulting in us or one of our neighbors having to call the police. So one day, my mother looked out the front door and snapped after seeing how many leaves and other crap from the neighbor's bushes were laying in our front yard. She ran into the garage, grabbed a lawn bag, put a bunch of stuff that was laying in our front yard into it, and threw it in front of my neighbor's door. Illegal in Germany. A few hours later, my neighbor came to us, being petty and all smug, saying he'd sue us and that we'd have to pay loads and loads of money for ruining his front yard with our garbage, etc. Afterwards, he took photos of our house and even zoomed into our windows, illegal as well, which I was lucky to see through my window and record him doing it. I then proceeded to look into city regulations and soon found out that we couldn't really do anything about their leaves falling in our front yard, but there is an extra clause in the regulations which states that this only applies for as long as the other party's living conditions are not compromised. When our neighbor then went through with his lawsuit, I was completely prepared to ruin his day. The judge wanted to make it a quick case, but our lawyer showed her all the evidence that clearly showed him the leaves were 1. Compromising our living quality by blocking our drains with his garbage, and 2. He was breaking privacy laws by filming our house without consent. Further, my mom has a disabled ID due to her illness, which combined with us telling her, the judge, for how long we had to endure all this, led to the charges against us being dropped and him having to pay a fee for breaking privacy laws and him having to do something against his bushes. My neighbor was then given 2 options on how he could proceed. 1, he somehow manages to stop the leaves from falling on our property, or he has to tear everything down and has to build another form of protection, which would not compromise our living quality. He had 1 month to find a solution, but ended up not finding one, which led him to having to tear down the whole thing. My mom was happier than I'd ever seen her in the past 10 years and sat through the whole thing. The only thing that was missing to make all of this perfect was her having popcorn. And our next story. Cheat on me with my best friend? I'll wreck your career and publicly humiliate both of you. Craphead and Sarah have been like family to my wife and I for several years, practically ever since we moved in across the street from them. The 4 of us were extremely tight. Our kids are the same age as theirs and are all good friends. We're one big family unit. We did dinner together a few times a week. We went on vacations together. I truly saw Craphead as a brother, and my wife and Sarah were very close too. 5 months ago, I was completely blindsided by the discovery of an affair between my wife and Craphead. My wife had left her email open on our computer, and I saw an email from her to her longtime therapist saying that Craphead would be joining her at an upcoming session again. WTF. My mind started racing. Why in the world would Craphead be going to her therapy sessions without my knowledge? I did a search and found some other emails to and from the therapist proving that Craphead had been going to sessions together with her for about 6 weeks. I checked our mobile phone account and discovered that since late summer, they'd been exchanging hundreds of texts a day, peaking at nearly 500 a day by the holidays. Speaking of the holidays, my wife and I hosted both of our families, parents, siblings, etc., for both Thanksgiving and Christmas dinner, and Craphead and Sarah joined us either for dinner or after dinner on both holidays. Text records showed that the entire time that they were at our house celebrating with our families, my wife and Craphead were texting each other across the room. They were doing that pretty much every time the four of us hung out, for months. And, all day, every day, just in general. But what bothers me the most is that they were doing it with Sarah and I right there. I confronted my wife with the evidence, and she admitted that, yes, she and Craphead had fallen in love. It just happened. I don't know how. But I love him, and I just don't feel anything for you anymore. I'm sorry. They'd gone on a school district trip together, something had happened in her hotel room, and things had moved quickly from there. She explained as I lay face down on the couch, unable to look at her, that they had already made plans to move out and divorce me and Sarah, and while they didn't plan to move in together immediately because of the kids, they'd probably do so eventually. The meetings with the therapist were supposedly mostly for the purpose of finding a way to break this to me and Sarah as gently as possible, because they were so concerned for our well-being. Sarah and I are fairly certain that they weren't planning on telling us about the affair at all, and were simply going to discover their feelings for one another several months down the line, after they'd come up with some other reasons to divorce the two of us. My wife moved out 2 months ago. I was, and still am, utterly destroyed. I cry every day. I cried writing the first few paragraphs of this story just now. I worry nonstop about the impact on our kids. But I'm also not exactly a shrinking violet when I feel that I've been wronged, and in this case I was, objectively, very, very wrong. So a couple years ago, Craphead ran for a Board of Education seat as a pretty extreme underdog. I helped him with his campaign materials and debate prep, and my wife, a well-known school district employee, this becomes important later, got the word out as best she could. Much to our surprise, he actually won in a squeaker by just a few dozen votes. Being on the board became the center of Craphead's world. He joined every committee that he could. This turned into the foundation of his affair with my wife, as they were constantly going to school events and meetings together on evenings and weekends. Once I discovered the affair, my thoughts turned pretty quickly to revenge, and it occurred to me that an extramarital affair between a member of the Board of Education and an employee of the school district was at least bad politics and possibly violated district policy. Making things far worse for them was that my wife was in the running for an open administrative position, and everyone knew that she was more or less guaranteed the job and the major pay raise that came with it. She had just finished her master's degree in school administration at the urging of her principal and the superintendent, so that she could be promoted to this specific position. I had plenty of evidence of the affair, texts from both of them admitting to it, text records showing that they were texting hundreds of times a day, emails to and from the therapist, etc., that I considered simply emailing all of the evidence to the board and the superintendent, but felt like I, as the grieving betrayed spouse, might not be seen as a credible source. So instead, I invented a fictitious, furious friend who was planning on showing up to the next board meeting and publicly shaming the two of them for their affair. I told my wife that I'd tried to talk this person down, but couldn't guarantee that they wouldn't show up and humiliate them publicly. As I expected, this led Craphead to conclude that the only option was for him to preemptively admit the affair to the board. The superintendent subsequently recommended that Craphead resign, which he did. Sarah said that he was utterly humiliated and crushed and barely got out of bed for a few days afterward. Once word of the affair and Craphead's resignation started getting around, the superintendent, a longtime friend of both my wife and Craphead, contacted my wife and tearfully informed her that it was no longer politically appropriate for her to be promoted to an administrative position within the district. The position had been lined up for her and was later filled by an outside candidate. This sent waves of confusion and rumor throughout the district, as it was pretty well known that my wife was getting the job. The day after she was informed that she wasn't getting the promotion, my wife and I, despite our crumbling marriage, took our son out to breakfast together on his birthday, and a parent stopped by our table to congratulate her on her new role. She said thanks, then excused herself to go cry in the bathroom for a while. I let the dust settle for a couple weeks, and then, right before my wife moved out, let them in on my little secret. There never was a furious friend threatening to expose them in the first place. Just me. Word of all this has gotten around our fairly small town, which Craphead grew up in and my wife has worked in for nearly 20 years. My wife refuses to talk to me about how things are at work now, but I've heard from some people I know in the district that her formerly spotless reputation has taken a major hit. Craphead, formerly a gregarious social presence in our neighborhood and at events and pubs in town, has completely gone underground and barely emerges to mow his lawn. He's moving out soon to a crappy little townhouse, which is all he can afford due to all the child support he's going to have to pay his wife. My wife and Craphead claim that they plan on trying to make things work together despite all the public humiliation. I wish them lots of luck with that. I'm sure it'll be a lot of fun to show their faces together in town. Hey guys, thank you all for watching the video. I'll see you in the next one.